believe in forgiving or forgetting?
So it's Thanksgiving. Again. The air is cold, sharp in that Midwestern way, the kind of cold that makes your nose sting the second you step out of the car and into your parents' driveway, where nothing ever changes except the grass gets more yellow and the house seems to sink a little deeper into its foundation every year. The driveway is lined with tiny plastic pumpkins and one of those silly little chalkboard signs Mom loves so much, with "Welcome, Family," written in perfect faux handwriting like we're guests at some Airbnb and not the people she birthed. I climb the steps, balancing a tray of sweet potatoes I don't even like, and when the door opens, the smell of turkey, starch, and suppressed resentment hits me like an old blanket I never wanted to see again. Mom smiles her tight little smile, the one she saves for neighbors and cashiers, and gives me that weird one-arm hug that says, "I'm pretending to be affectionate, but let's not get too emotional." Dad's somewhere in the kitchen, wearing his stupid apron that says King of carving a bird like it's a ritual sacrifice. I make it past the threshold, drop the tray on the counter, and go through the motions. Smile. Nod. Ask about the neighbors. Comment on how big the twins are now. Pretend I didn't drive here rehearsing the same sentence over and over in my head. This is the last time I come here if they do it again. And of course, it comes. Like clockwork. Every single year, right after the pie hits the table and before anyone has had enough wine to interrupt him, Dad stands up and clinks a spoon against his glass. Drew is across the table, grinning with his stupid perfect teeth, his 3 kids already fighting over whipped cream, his wife pretending not to notice. He always looks so comfortable here, like he belongs in a room full of expectations, while I sit there like someone who wandered in from the cold and couldn't find their coat. Dad clears his throat, the room quiets, and it begins. "We just want to take a moment," he says, hand on Mom's shoulder, "to say how truly blessed we are this year." He looks around like he's scanning a crowd, but I already know where his eyes are going to land. Especially when we look at our son Drew and all he's accomplished. Raising 3 amazing kids, building a life with a strong, beautiful woman, and doing his best to provide, even when things got tough. That's real strength, folks. The way he says "folks" makes me feel like I'm sitting in a church basement, not a dining room. Everyone nods, smiles, even applauds a little. Drew does this humble head bob thing like he's just been knighted. I wait. I know what's coming next. It always comes next. The token bone. And of course, Dad says, "We're proud of Leah too. Helping kids at that school of hers. Always thoughtful. Always helpful." That's it. That's the line. No mention of the hours I sat in a hospital after Mom's stroke. No mention of paying their electric bill during that one bad winter. No comment on how I bring food, clean up, and stay late every holiday while everyone else disappears the second pie is cut. Just thoughtful and helpful, like I'm a particularly useful Roomba. I glance at Mom. Her smile is frozen, polite. She doesn't look at me. She looks at Drew, and I can almost see the glow in her eyes. That adoration she saves for him, like she's still watching him run across a high school football field even though it's been over 20 years since he last touched a ball. I want to scream. I want to knock over the damn sweet potatoes and say, "What the hell do I have to do to get the same look?" But instead, I help clear the table. I gather plates, scrape half-eaten stuffing into the trash, rinse dishes while Mom flutters around saying things like Leah always knows how to keep things running, like I'm some kind of dependable household appliance. Drew is on the couch already, kids draped over him, his wife scrolling on her phone. Dad disappears to the garage, probably for a cigar. It's the same dance every year, and I know every step. I should be numb to it by now. I thought I was. Until it slipped. I was alone with Mom in the kitchen, stacking dishes. The clink of ceramic, the hum of the dishwasher, her humming some old Bing Crosby song like we were in a Norman Rockwell painting. And out of nowhere, my mouth betrayed me. "Funny how being blessed always means ignoring half your family," I said, not loud, but not exactly whispered either. She froze. The stack of plates in her hands didn't move. For a moment, she didn't breathe. "What did you say?" she asked, not angry, just confused. Like a person trying to figure out if a smoke alarm was real or just the toast again. I said, and this time I looked right at her. It must be nice to be proud of someone so easily. There was a long pause. I thought she'd say something. Deny it. Deflect it. Blame me for being too sensitive, the phrase that has been following me around since I was 12 years old. But she didn't. She just quietly put down the plates and walked out of the kitchen, not even glancing back. I heard her footsteps go down the hallway. A door clicked shut. Then nothing. I didn't stay much longer. I told Drew I had to get home to feed the cat. I don't even have a cat. The house felt quieter than usual, not peaceful but too quiet, like the air after a power outage, like something important had just been turned off. No one asked me to stay. No one even said goodbye except the youngest of Drew's kids, who hugged my leg with sticky hands and ran off. I drove home in silence, no music, no calls. Just the faint echo of my father's speech ringing in my ears like a bruise that wouldn't fade. And then, somewhere around 9:30, just as I was pouring myself a glass of wine and kicking off my shoes, the text came in. From Drew. Mom locked herself in her room. What did you say? And all I could think, staring at my phone, was how absurd that question was. As if one sentence, one tiny, inconvenient sentence, could crack open a house built on decades of denial. As if the truth, spoken softly and finally, was more damaging than all the years it went unsaid. I didn't answer right away. I didn't even know what to say. But I knew this much. This year, something shifted. And there's no putting it back. The glass of wine in my hand had long gone warm by the time I finally sat down on the edge of my couch, the kind that sags just slightly in the middle from too many nights of overthinking in the dark, and stared at my phone, still glowing softly on the coffee table, casting a strange kind of light that made the whole room feel colder than it already was. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows just enough to remind me of how old this building really was, and for a moment, I imagined my parents' house, the heavy curtains pulled closed, the smell of leftovers leaking from under the kitchen door, and somewhere down the hall, a locked bedroom with my mother inside, the silence stretching like a warning. I hadn't replied to Drew's message, not because I didn't know what to say, but because part of me didn't want to give him the satisfaction of an answer, especially not after what had just happened. The tiniest fracture in the carefully polished facade of our family unit, a single sentence that had hit harder than years of forced smiles and polite avoidance. But still, I couldn't ignore it forever, and when I finally picked up my phone, fingers cold and stiff from gripping the glass for too long, I typed the words slowly, deliberately, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you're too tired to lie anymore. I said nothing I haven't thought for 20 years. The message sent before I could stop it, that familiar whoosh of finality that felt both satisfying and terrifying, like setting fire to a letter you swore you'd never send, but couldn't stop rereading. I didn't expect him to reply right away, and he didn't, which was just as well, because the last thing I wanted was a middle-of-the-night sibling therapy session with the golden boy, especially when I knew that no matter what he said, the next words out of his mouth would be some version of "she's fragile," or "you didn't have to go that far," or the worst one, the one I knew was coming eventually, "you're being dramatic." Instead of waiting, I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and started pulling out the leftovers I had packed for myself before I left, a sad little pile of Tupperware containers that looked more like evidence than dinner. I wasn't even hungry, but I needed something to do. Anything to distract from the buzzing in my brain and the heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with years of being invisible in a house full of people who swore they loved me. I reheated some mashed potatoes, poured another glass of wine, this time fresh, and sat back down at the table, suddenly aware of how silent my apartment was, how the only sound was the low hum of the fridge and the occasional creak from the heating vents. Like the place itself was trying to fill in for all the conversations that never happened. I thought about calling someone, an old friend, maybe, or my coworker Melissa, who once confessed that her mother hadn't spoken to her in 6 years after she came out, but it felt too late, too heavy, and besides, I didn't want sympathy. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted someone to say, "You're not crazy, Leah. You saw it exactly as it was." And yet, Even saying that out loud made me feel selfish, like I was asking too much. Isn't that what they always made me feel? Like I was asking too much? Eventually, I sat down at my laptop, the glow of the screen washing over my tired face like some kind of sterile moonlight, and I did what I hadn't done in years. I started writing. Not a journal entry, not a blog post, but a letter. A letter to my mother. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't poetic. It was raw and a little messy, but it was mine, and it poured out of me like it had been waiting at the door for decades. I told her about how it felt to watch her beam at Drew during his engagement dinner, while barely acknowledging that I had just broken off a 3-year relationship with someone I thought I'd marry. I reminded her of the time I drove 3 hours to take her to a follow-up appointment after her stroke while Drew couldn't get away from work, only to be told later that week that he's just got so much on his plate. I described how small I felt at every birthday dinner, every holiday brunch, every family photo where I was always placed at the edge, like a distant cousin who got invited out of obligation. And then I wrote something I hadn't planned to write. I told her that I had tried for years to be easy, to not complain, to not bring up the things that hurt because I knew she hated drama, hated dwelling, hated anything that made her feel uncomfortable or guilty. But I was done shielding her from herself. I ended the letter with a sentence I had never dared say aloud. I think you loved me the best way you knew how, but it was never the way I needed. I didn't send it. Not that night, anyway. I saved it as a draft, closed the laptop, and sat back, staring at the ceiling like it might hold some kind of answer. But there was nothing there. Just the usual cracks and shadows and the faint, steady drip of the kitchen faucet I still hadn't fixed. It was almost midnight when my phone buzzed again, jolting me upright. I picked it up, heart suddenly racing like I was 17 again and caught sneaking in after curfew. It was another message from Drew. You don't get it. She's not angry. She's scared. I read it 3 times, trying to understand if it was meant to guilt me or explain her reaction, but the more I read it, the more I realized something I hadn't dared believe until that moment. I had struck something real. Not petty. Not performative. Not some fleeting tantrum. I had hit the part of her she thought she buried, the part that remembered how she used to be before she became the person who judged her daughter for not having children, or a husband, or the patience to keep smiling while being ignored. And yet, even with that small, bitter victory bubbling inside me, I felt no joy. Just a strange kind of ache, like pulling a splinter out of your skin only to realize it was the thing holding the wound shut. I didn't reply to Drew's second message either. Instead, I opened the draft again, stared at the blinking cursor, and added one more line. You asked what I said. But maybe the real question is, why didn't I say it sooner? Then I saved it again, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark, letting the quiet remind me of just how long I'd been waiting to be heard. It was almost a week before I heard from him again, and I'll admit, part of me had hoped the silence would stretch out longer, not because I wanted to ignore it all, but because I needed the space, the breathing room, the time to process what had unraveled in that kitchen, under that flickering overhead light, in a house where I had spent half my life shrinking myself so everyone else could feel tall. I hadn't sent the letter to my mother, although I had read it back to myself more times than I could count, and every time I came to the end, every time I saw that final sentence sitting there like a slow-burning match, just waiting for friction, I told myself I'd hit send the next day. But the next day always came with doubt, an old familiar presence, like a coat you try to throw away, but keep finding in the closet anyway. And then, without any warning, a simple message from Drew popped up on my phone late Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of my office hours, where I was supposed to be helping some sophomore navigate community college applications, but instead sat staring blankly at the screen, feeling the weight of his words before I even opened them. Can we talk? That was it. No punctuation. No context. Just those 3 words that could mean anything from a peace offering to a declaration of war, and the frustrating thing was, I didn't even know which one I wanted it to be. I waited until the next morning before I replied, just a quick tomorrow. Coffee. 11, followed by the address of a tiny cafe on the east side of town where no one knew me, and where I could walk out without a scene if it came to that. I didn't ask how Mom was doing. I didn't ask if she was still locked in her room or if she had emerged to give her blessing over dinner like nothing happened. I didn't want to know. I wasn't ready to climb back into the cycle of pretending everything was fine just because the door was open again. When he walked in, he looked tired, not dramatically so, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but I saw it in the slight slump of his shoulders, the deeper creases around his eyes. The way his mouth was set in a line that wasn't quite a frown but definitely wasn't a smile. He spotted me right away, raised a hand halfway like he wasn't sure if he should wave or salute or apologize, and then slid into the seat across from me, tapping the table once with his palm as if to say, "Okay, here we go." For a moment, neither of us said anything. I just watched the steam curl up from my cup and waited for him to fill the space, which he did, eventually, in that cautious tone I hadn't heard from him since we were kids, and he broke Mom's favorite vase and blamed it on the dog. "I know you think I've had it easy," he started, voice low, like he was afraid someone might overhear a truth too delicate to say out loud. "And you're not wrong. I got the praise, the attention, the benefit of the doubt. But Leah, I need you to know something. I didn't ask for any of it." I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly convenient for him to say that now, after decades of soaking up every ounce of love and pride while I sat on the sidelines clapping for a performance I was never invited to join. But instead, I kept my face neutral and let him talk, because I needed to hear what version of the story he was about to spin, and whether it would match the one I had lived. "I didn't even realize how deep it went until last year," he continued, running a hand through his hair in that way people do when they're trying to stall. "Beth, my wife, she said something that stuck with me. She said, it's like your mom looks at you and sees her success, and looks at Leah and sees her own failure." He winced, like saying it out loud made it worse, and for a brief second, I saw something crack open in him, something raw and unpolished that reminded me of when we were little and he used to sneak into my room after nightmares. Just a boy looking for a place to feel safe. He went on to tell me things I hadn't expected to hear, that his marriage was barely holding on by a thread, that Beth had given him an ultimatum after she caught him lying about money again, that his job was technically still pending, because they hadn't officially fired him, but the writing was on the wall. He looked at me, eyes heavy, and said, "I feel like I've been living someone else's life. Like I got cast in a role and forgot how to be a real person." I didn't say anything right away. I just sat there, letting it all settle in, letting the idea sink that maybe he wasn't the bulletproof golden boy after all, that maybe being the favorite came with its own kind of curse. And then, quietly, carefully, I said what I had been holding in for far too long. "You think being the favorite meant they loved you more. Maybe they did. But it also meant they expected you to carry their legacy." I didn't get love, Drew. I got silence. But at least I could breathe in it. He blinked like he hadn't thought of it that way before, and I realized that for all his charm and accolades and pat-on-the-back moments, he had never really seen me as someone with wounds. He had seen me as the stable one, the background character who never demanded too much screen time, the sister who would always stay one step behind so he could shine. And maybe I had let him, out of guilt, or love, or just sheer exhaustion. We sat there for a long time, sipping our drinks and talking about things we'd never dared mention before, our parents' subtle manipulations, the way Dad always made me feel like ambition was a burden, the way Mom used guilt like a fishing line to keep us tethered. At one point, Drew leaned back and said, "You know, I used to think you were jealous of me. But now I think maybe you were just braver than I was. You didn't play their game. You didn't need them to clap for you." That made something in me ache, because maybe he was right, and maybe that bravery cost me something I'll never fully get back. But still, there was a strange sense of relief in hearing him say it, like finally being recognized after years of being dismissed as the one who was fine. When we stood up to leave, there was no hug, no dramatic moment of reconciliation, just a quiet kind of understanding that wasn't quite peace, but something close enough to pretend. As we walked out, he paused by the door and said, almost as an afterthought, "By the way, Mom hasn't come out much since you left. She's not just ignoring you. She's not really talking to Dad either. She's been crying off and on for days." I looked at him, trying to read between the lines, trying to figure out if he was blaming me or warning me or simply reporting the facts. But all I could say was, sometimes the truth feels worse than a lie, especially when it's been hiding in plain sight. He nodded, as if that made sense to him, and then we parted ways, both of us carrying something unspoken between us, regret, maybe, or guilt, or just the weight of being raised in a house where love was a currency, and some of us were always underpaid. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. Not to him. Not to them. Not even to myself. There is something strange about the silence that follows emotional confrontation, not the silence of peace or acceptance, but the kind that wraps around your thoughts like smoke, lingering long after the fire has gone cold, thick with things unsaid, heavy with the weight of decisions you can't yet name but somehow already know are irreversible. In the days that followed my meeting with Drew, that particular kind of silence sat with me in my apartment like an uninvited guest, hovering in the corner while I made my coffee. Curling up beside me at night when the television hummed in the background and I stared blankly at the screen, unable to tell if I was watching something or just letting it keep me company so I wouldn't hear my own breathing. I hadn't talked to anyone since the cafe. I hadn't texted him, hadn't checked in on my mother, hadn't even looked at the unread messages in the family group chat that had, for years, existed solely for the purpose of scheduling holidays and sending blurry photos of casseroles or grandkids holding up construction paper turkeys. But the letter, that raw, unfinished, too honest to delete letter I had written to my mother, kept calling to me like a splinter left under the skin, not quite visible but aching every time I moved. I would open the draft at least once a day, read over the lines I had poured out like a confession, and then, with my cursor hovering over the send button, I would freeze, not out of fear of the consequences, but out of something far more insidious. The fear that even after all that truth, after all that vulnerability, the only response I'd get would be silence. Or worse, a deflection. Or a pat on the head and a "we did our best," like that was supposed to erase decades of imbalance and neglect and the kind of subtle cruelty that never bruises but always scars. It was Saturday afternoon when I finally broke. The sky outside was a dull gray that seemed to have no end, the kind of weather that presses down on you like an unfinished argument, and I had spent the better part of the morning cleaning things that didn't need to be cleaned just to avoid sitting with myself. The fridge was spotless. The baseboards were wiped down. I even vacuumed behind the couch, which I hadn't done in months. And yet, nothing cleared the fog in my head. So I sat down at the kitchen table, opened the laptop, and without rereading the letter this time, without editing or second-guessing or trying to polish the rawness into something more palatable, I hit send. It felt like nothing at first. Just a quiet ping of confirmation, and then the eerie stillness that follows a scream when no one hears you. I closed the laptop, stood up, and waited for something to happen, some reaction, some shift in the air, anything to acknowledge that I had done the thing I swore for years I wouldn't do. But of course, the world kept turning. The radiator hissed. A dog barked down the street. Somewhere, a train passed. And I was still alone, still waiting. The rest of the day passed like molasses. I tried to distract myself with errands, walking the aisles of the grocery store without buying anything of consequence, wandering through the bookstore and thumbing through novels I had no intention of reading. But no matter what I did, the weight of what I had sent clung to me like damp clothes, uncomfortable and inescapable, reminding me with every breath that there was no undoing it now. I had exposed myself in a way I never had before, laid out my truth with no filter, and now I just had to live with whatever came next. It wasn't until Monday evening that something did. I came home from work, exhausted in that specific way that comes from being around teenagers all day, too many questions, too much noise, too much pretending to be composed when all you want is 5 minutes of stillness. I kicked off my shoes, tossed my bag on the couch, and went to check the mailbox, not expecting anything but bills and flyers. But there, among the usual clutter, was an envelope that made my stomach drop. It was plain, cream-colored, with my name written on the front in a familiar, hesitant script I hadn't seen in years. My father's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, too long, probably, the kind of stare you give a ticking clock in a dream, where time doesn't move unless you blink. Eventually, I took it upstairs, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it with a kind of careful reverence usually reserved for sacred things, funeral notices, wedding invitations, the last letters from someone you know you'll never see again. Inside, there was no note. No letter. Just a single photo. It was old, clearly pulled from one of the family albums that lived in the hallway cabinet back home, the ones Mom kept perfectly arranged by year but rarely opened. The photo was of me, 10 years old, maybe 11, standing alone in the backyard beside a birthday cake with leaning candles and one of those plastic tablecloths that always stuck to your elbows. I was smiling, but it was that forced, uncertain smile kids give when they're not quite sure if the camera's meant for them. There was no one else in the photo. No guests. No decorations. Just me and the cake and the empty yard. On the back of the photo, in the same handwriting as the envelope, were 2 words. I forgot. That was it. I sat there for a long time, photo in hand, heart pounding, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of stunned realization I hadn't been ready for. My father, my stubborn, emotionally mute father, had remembered something. Maybe not the whole thing. Maybe not what it meant. But something had broken through, something sharp enough or real enough or haunting enough to move him to send this, as if to say, without saying it, I didn't see you then. But I see you now. And yet, even as I held that photo, even as a lump formed in my throat and my eyes burned with the sting of tears I didn't want to shed, I couldn't help but wonder who had really sent it. Because something about the gesture felt too pointed, too precise, too rooted in emotional context to be from the man who once told me, without flinching, that girls like you should be grateful someone puts up with you. And that doubt planted a seed I couldn't ignore. Later that night, I called Drew, not to accuse, not even to ask, but just to hear his voice, to see if he would give himself away. He didn't. He kept things casual, light, like we were easing into a new phase of our relationship where we didn't talk about the big things unless we were cornered into it. But something in the way he asked, "Did you get anything in the mail?" Not too curious, not too detached, told me he knew exactly what had arrived. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. Whether it came from him or from Dad didn't matter in the end. What mattered was that for the first time in my life, I had said my piece. And the ripple it sent through my family, quiet, subtle, but undeniable, was still moving, still unsettling things that had long been buried. I placed the photo on the fridge with a magnet that said, "Tell the truth, even if your voice shakes," and stood there for a long moment, staring at the image of that little girl, alone with her cake, smiling into the absence of attention, and I whispered, not for her, but for myself, "I remember you, and I will not let them forget again." It wasn't a sudden decision, nor was it prompted by any great revelation or push from guilt. It was more like the slow turning of a tide, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface until it became undeniable. A current too strong to resist, dragging me back toward the house I had so carefully distanced myself from. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since I sent the letter, and in that time, I had lived in a strange kind of limbo, not quite estranged, but not exactly welcome, suspended somewhere between estrangement and reconciliation, where every text from Drew felt like a coded message and every silence from my mother throbbed like a toothache you keep touching, even when you know it only makes the pain worse. Then, without warning, just a simple message from Drew, short, deliberate, and typed in that annoyingly emotionless tone that always seemed to say more by what it refused to acknowledge. "She wants to see you." No greeting. No explanation. Not even a "hey." Just those 5 words, dropped into my phone like a stone into still water, sending ripples that disturbed the fragile calm I'd spent weeks constructing. I read the message once, then again, and by the 3rd reading, I could feel my throat tightening, not from fear exactly, but from something heavier, anticipation mixed with dread. The ghost of every holiday dinner where I swallowed my own voice like a bitter pill just to keep the peace. I didn't answer right away. I went to the sink, ran cold water over my wrists like it could cleanse the sudden heat rising beneath my skin, and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, not recognizing the expression on my face but knowing, without question, that I was going to go. The drive felt longer than usual, Even though I'd made that trip dozens, maybe hundreds of times before, but this time, the familiarity of the road only heightened the tension, like revisiting a childhood neighborhood after years away. Everything looks the same, but nothing feels safe. The trees still arched over the back roads in that same protective way. The same gas station still stood at the corner of Maple and Fifth, and yet, as I turned onto their street, I felt like I was approaching something final, as though this wasn't just a visit, but a reckoning, the kind you spend your whole life bracing for without even knowing it. When she opened the door, she didn't smile, didn't rush to embrace me, didn't say my name like it was a homecoming. She simply stepped aside and motioned for me to enter, as if I were someone returning to collect something long overdue, not a daughter, but a witness. The air inside the house was stuffier than I remembered, the kind of stale that only accumulates when too much emotion has been sealed behind walls for too long, and although nothing had changed, the same floral wallpaper, the same coffee-stained rug, the same dusty frames lining the hallway, it felt distinctly different, like the house itself had aged in the absence of clarity. We didn't go to the kitchen. She led me to the living room, the formal one they only ever used during holidays or funerals, and gestured for me to sit. She remained standing for a moment, hands folded tightly in front of her like she didn't trust them not to shake, and then, finally, she lowered herself into the chair across from me with the kind of care reserved for delicate things, porcelain, perhaps, or a truth too long untouched. The silence stretched between us like an invisible rope, pulling taut with everything we hadn't said. I didn't speak. I wanted her to go first, not because I thought she owed me that, though maybe she did, but because I needed to know whether she had come to make amends or simply to regain control. "I read your letter," she said at last, her voice smaller than I remembered, lacking its usual sharpness, like something had been drained from her. Twice. The first time I got angry. The second time, I didn't know what to feel. I waited. I wanted to give her space, but I also needed her to fill it, to name the thing we had danced around for years. "I never meant to hurt you, Leah," she continued, eyes fixed on the floor like it might absolve her. I was so focused on keeping things together, on making sure Drew had what he needed. He always seemed like he was on the edge of something, some crisis, some disappointment, and you were strong. You didn't need me. Or so I thought. I bit the inside of my cheek, not because I was angry, but because I could feel something rising in me, a mixture of grief, release, and the deep, painful recognition that we were finally standing at the same mirror, even if we were still looking at different reflections. "You didn't think I needed you because I didn't fall apart in front of you," I said slowly, deliberately, measuring every word. "But I didn't fall apart because I knew there was no one there to catch me. You think strength means silence. It doesn't. It just means no one was listening." She looked up then, her eyes shining, and for the first time, I saw not the mother who always had an answer or a judgment or a reason to redirect the conversation, but a woman flawed, human, and suddenly very, very tired. "I didn't know how to love you the way you needed to be loved," she said. "I didn't have the tools. My mother was cold. My father was absent. I did what I knew." I nodded, not because it excused her, but because I understood the curse of inherited damage, the kind that passes down like a quilt of unfinished apologies, stitched together by people who never learned to say "I'm sorry" without choking on it. "You weren't the daughter I expected," she added quietly. "You were smarter. You saw more. You challenged me. And that scared me." That sentence sat between us like a weight, and I realized then, maybe for the first time, that her distance had never been indifference, it had been fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what I represented. A mirror of her own limitations. A reminder of what she didn't become. "I wasn't the daughter you wanted," I said, voice thick. "But I was the daughter you had. And I deserved to be seen." We didn't cry. We didn't hug. We didn't stand up and hold hands like a made-for-TV moment where everything is magically healed by a single afternoon of honesty. What we did was sit quietly, painfully, and for a long time, acknowledging the truth like a wound we were finally willing to stop ignoring. And maybe that's all healing really is, not a dramatic reconciliation, but a slow, reluctant agreement to stop pretending. When I left, the sky was beginning to turn, the sun dipping low and casting everything in that golden, unforgiving light that makes even the ugliest things look beautiful for a moment. As I stepped out onto the porch, I caught a glimpse through the window, my father, hunched at the kitchen counter, holding the photo I'd received in the mail, staring at it like it held a secret he couldn't quite decipher. I watched as he picked up the phone, his expression unreadable, his lips moving in a way that suggested urgency or maybe regret, but I couldn't hear the words, and I didn't want to. Because that photo, the one I had assumed he had sent, the one that had cracked something open in me, wasn't written in his handwriting. It was Drew's. I knew it then, with a certainty that felt like being pushed underwater and suddenly remembering how to swim. And in that moment, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt acknowledged. In his own way, my brother had tried to give me something he knew our parents never would, a memory reframed, a gesture of solidarity, an admission, however quiet, that I hadn't imagined at all. And maybe that's the most anyone ever gets in families like ours, not justice, not perfect clarity, not a sweeping confession that makes the years of hurt vanish, but these small, deliberate moments of truth, offered without condition, and received without denial. As I drove away, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, I didn't feel closure. I didn't feel peace. But I felt present. Finally, fully present in my own life, no longer waiting for someone else's words to give mine permission to exist. That Thanksgiving was the last one we ever had together. There were no more speeches. No more silent dinners. No more carefully staged photos around a table where I didn't feel welcome. And no, my mother never apologized. Not completely. But she never looked at me the same way again. She didn't look through me. And sometimes, in families like mine, that's the closest thing you get to forgiveness.